He presses his fingertip into the soft mortar and drags the point down for the 5th tally when the iron key scrapes the lock and the cell door shoves open. Abandonment sits in the room like cold stone. He tastes it as salt on his lips and counts it with his knuckles. The first sentence of the chapter must hold a violent event, the tally interrupted, and it does. The guard's boot lands in the threshold, voice clipped. Guard. Hands, the prisoner snaps his fingers away from the wall, turns his head, and the small candle teeters toward guttering. He is mid-count, and that single motion shows what he fears most. The system counts him out. He touches the fresh notch, fingers numb, and the act of marking becomes proof that someone else keeps time for him now. The immediate conflict is visible. A ritualized measurement of days and a power that enforces that counting. In the next minutes, the corridor supplies context without ceremony. He is known as the prisoner. He once held a pocket watch and a name that fit him in company. Now he hides initials carved under grime. He uses the watch to remember a mother's laugh and a street vendor's bell. Those are precise things, not metaphors. He keeps them small. The watch's cracked glass, the exact pitch of the bell, his mother's calloused thumb pressing his cheek. Those details matter. They are anchors the wardens strip away. He stands when the guard gestures. The guard's hand is blunt and practiced. Guard. Step to the threshold. He lifts the sleeve as if adjusting the light. The prisoner obeys. The warden watches from the corridor, a ledger open on his palm, and the ledger's brown pages smell of wax and dust. The warden tilts his head and notes a column. He writes without haste. The prisoner watches his face and names the motive in action. A clinical curiosity that treats a human body like a specimen. The warden does not elevate cruelty into rhetoric. He reduces the man into a line on a page. They move through beats that read as procedure. In the corridor, the warden annotates sensory reduction increments and instructs adjustments. Warden. Reduce light 2 notches. Remove timepieces. Note withdrawal responses. The guard repeats. Reduce light 2 notches. Remove timepieces. The prisoner hears the order and clasps the watch tighter. The removal of property is a small scene with a sharp edge. The guard kneels and takes the pocket watch from between the prisoner's fingers. The prisoner resists by squeezing the metal casing with clenched nails. Guard. Enough, the watch slips, thunks against the stone, and the guard tucks it into his palm like an object seized in evidence. The seizure strips a tether. He jerks the frayed sleeve over his wrist as if hiding a mark and feels the stubble along his jaw. He had counted on that watch's tick to pace his breathing. Now there is only the hollow between stone and stone. Left alone, he starts to speak to the cell walls as if they could answer. He traces numbers into the mortar with a fingernail. 1, 2, 3. He speaks them aloud to hold cadence against silence. The voice comes thin, a rasp that the cell returns like a bad copy. He mutters a memory to anchor himself. The exact shape of the vendor's bell, the notes it made when someone paid with a copper coin. He enunciates it like a prayer, not to a deity, but to the fact of having a past. The first emotion shift appears within this isolation. Doubt eases into fear. At first he doubts that the ledger will notice his carved initial. Then fear arrives when the warden steps back into the doorway and reads the mark with a detached frown. The warden runs a thumb across the carved initials and notes that the dates do not match official entries. He leaves his ledger open and tilts it toward the guard. The guard watches him while the prisoner traces a tally again. He begins to plead not with rhetorical flourishes but with short, concrete sentences. Prisoner. Warden, it's mine, it's all I have. The plea is tangible. The name of the object and the hands that held it. The warden looks up, blinks as if surprised by emotion, and records the plea as a single-line item. The warden's indifference registers as another emotion shift in the chapter. From fear into a cold resignation that becomes rage in the prisoner. The prisoner studies the ledger and finds a schedule of deprivation. He sees the phrase sensory decrement printed in the margin and understands the experiment's goal. Erase anchors to identity. He stands straighter only to feel the rawness of that realization. The prisoner decides to act. He takes the remaining watch face and, in a brutal small motion, snaps it under his heel until glass crackles. He gouges a fresh tally into his wrist with the broken rim. The action is a violent punctuation mark, a choice made to break the slow bureaucratic erosion on his own terms. The wound is immediate. It burns and the blood surprises him by how quickly it darkens the stone beneath. Warden. Notation: the guard signals with a slate tone, and the warden flips to a fresh page. He records the injury without commentary. The prisoner expects language. Outrage, pity, a demand for help. He gets the opposite, a line in a ledger and a stamped code. That administrative reaction is a narrative beat that reduces human rupture to data. After the wound, the chapter's cliffhanger slides in. As dawn pries light through the slit, the prisoner scrapes at the wall and finds a deeper tally under the grime, a different hand, an older chronology. He uncovers an initial that contradicts ledger dates. He calls out into the corridor, "Prisoner, look." There's another mark. The warden arrives and studies the mark with something like curiosity that is not pity. He murmurs, "This changes the record. The change is small but concrete. It reframes the ledger's authority and injects a fracture into the warden's control." This revelation shifts the emotional center again, from resignation to a brittle hope that something in the record resists inertia. The prisoner senses the ledger's fallibility as oxygen. He hurries to scrape more, fingers raw, and produces another tally hidden behind suit. The warden watches while the guard names procedure aloud. "Guard, seal the cell. Update entry." The guard's voice is short. It sets the scene into motion. The warden studies both the fresh wound and the uncovered tally. He puts down his pen and, for the first time in hours, touches his temple where a thin scar runs. He pauses, and that pause is an emotional event visible to the prisoner, an opening where the clinical certainty wavers. The prisoner reaches for that pause and speaks in a small, fast line. "Prisoner, you see it, warden. You see what they missed." He uses the warden's name often in his speech to bind the man's attention. The warden replies only, "Record updated," 2 words, precise and administrative. Dialogue here follows a pattern of short exchanges. Where conflict intensifies, 3-6 quick lines ripple back and forth. "Guard, stand back. Prisoner, you retaking everything, warden." "Everything necessary, prisoner." "My watch is not necessary, warden." Necessity is defined here. The brief argument reveals the warden's rigid vocabulary and the prisoner's collapsing syntax. After the confrontation, the warden acts decisively. He orders an increase in deprivation. "Warden, cut light by 2 notches. Begin sound cycles at Schedule B. Guard." Affirmative. The prisoner braces for further removal. He calculates, in precise gestures, how much of his routine the wardens can still take before memory slips. The chapter moves to its peak in a secluded, violent act. The prisoner gouges another deep mark into his wrist and breaks the remaining piece of the watch to deny the warden any data point of his past. This is the beat marked as climax. He chooses obliteration rather than the slow dismantling the system has designed. He makes the decision with frantic clarity. If the prison will count him out, he will count himself in by the only instrument that refuses ledger logic, pain chosen on his terms. The wound burns, blood wet on stone, and the prisoner presses the carved tally into the flesh until his knuckles whiten. He says nothing. Action is his language. "Guard, hold him, warden." "Not yet." The guard restrains him while the warden writes another entry. "Self-inflicted. Confirm observation." The entry is clinical and immediate. It treats a scream as data and a wound as a tick box. The emotional movement here is sharp. He moves from a brittle hope to a resigned violence. That is the second emotion shift mandated in the chapter, visible through his actions, the choice to harm himself, and through the warden's detached reply. The prisoner knows this will not end the experiment. He knows the ledger will absorb the act and carry on. Still, the gesture is a claim of agency visible to the guard and the warden. The guard records the wound in clipped tones. "Guard. He cut his wrist and broke the watch, warden." Note time and restraint used. The precise commands translate a human collapse into an administrative sequence. Time, notation, restraint. The prisoner feels nothing but a cool clarity as the adrenaline fades. Once the cell is sealed, the warden treats the event as a data point. He closes the ledger slowly, the leather's hinge protesting. He walks away and the guard locks the door with practiced movements. The prisoner sits beneath the stub of a candle. The wound throbs and a thin puddle darkens the mortar beneath his palm. He traces the tally again as if confirming the mark's presence to himself. The chapter cannot end in abstraction. It must close on a concrete situational beat that carries forward. The final scene shows the empty cell. The candle stub, the tally on the wall, the blood in a small puddle, and the ledger's new notation still wet with ink in the warden's office. The guard walks away, keys jangling. The last paragraph is short and situational. The warden closes the ledger, the guard turns the corridor corner, and the cell door seals with a soft iron thud. No philosophical summation follows. What remains is the material fact of the wound, and the new line in the ledger. That line will inform the system's next step. The prisoner pulls his knees to his chest and counts quietly with his fingertips, not as a metaphor, but as a physical motion that keeps him seated in the present. He presses his thumb into the fresh mark, and the taste of metal rises on his tongue as the chapter ends on the stubbed candle and the ledger's ink drying. Throughout the chapter, the emotion root of abandonment appears and motivates his choices. He cuts himself rather than wait to be cut out. The chapter contains two clear emotion shifts: doubt into fear, into resignation, and then into brittle hope, into violent agency. Every shift is enacted through gestures, dialogue, and immediate external events: the removal of the watch, the discovery of the hidden tally, and the self-inflicted wound. The narrative follows the beat supplied. The tally interrupted, ledger and orders, property removed, voices and fracture, hidden mark revealed, decision for oblivion, the climax, clinical accounting, and the smoldering echo. External events occur regularly, and the chapter resolves its mini-conflict. The warden's claim of authority is exposed to a factual inconsistency, and the prisoner asserts agency, though the cost is personal and brutal. Names are used to anchor speech. The prisoner calls the warden by title when he needs attention. He calls the guard's presence with short demands. The warden replies with administrative cadence. The language remains concrete. The watch's cracked glass, the exact scrape of the key, the ledger's brown pages, the candle stub's irregular burn. There is no symbolic fog, no metaphors that mask sensations. Every emotional beat is visible in a hand, a recorded line, a wound, or a spoken sentence. The chapter ends without a perfunctory reflection. Instead, it ends with a situational beat that signals continuity. The ledger bears a new inscription, and the cell contains a man who has purposely broken an anchor to memory. The system will interpret the act through its categories. The prisoner has altered the raw material the system uses. The result is both a small fracture in the warden's control and a personal obliteration the prisoner chose. The stub of candle gutters slightly, and the tally on the wall remains, precise and stubborn. As the guard's footsteps fade, the experiment continues. Records will guide the next increment. The warden clicks a brass stopwatch closed with the same sound the prisoner has come to dread. Fear lives in the prisoner's throat. It squeezes his breathing and makes his fingertips go numb. A guard shifts a chain on the corridor floor. Warden, the guard says, the extension is recorded. The warden scratches 2 extra days into the ledger and does not look up. The corridor smells of metal and sweat. The prisoner watches through the narrow slit and presses a knuckle into the mortar of his inner wrist, where the tally marks live. He remembers the last time he carved the 5th tally into the wall, the scraping of stone under skin, the iron key that had scraped the lock that day. That memory sits beside his fear and pushes him to act. He thinks of that tally day and counts inward, trying to find a reason to keep steady. The warden's handwriting is precise. Lines of obligation and experiment nestle between dates. The warden says, it is not punishment. It is protocol. The narrator, standing a few paces behind, clears his throat and records words in a small leather-bound ledger. Narrator, the prisoner says aloud, voice thin and raw, you are writing us down like a machine. The narrator's pen sighs across the page, but he does not look away. Doubt sits at the edge of the prisoner's jaw. He has suspected that the ledger's numbers mean more than time, and his doubt hardens when the warden slides the brass stopwatch back into his palm. The warden moves his lips without smiling. We remove comforts. We remove markers. We observe. The prisoner counts the steps of the guards as they return to their posts. Each footfall is a beat that tightens his chest. A guard unbolts the outer door for a moment, and the corridor's light knocks a slim rectangle across the stone. The prisoner presses his nails into his palm until the pain steadies his pulse. He had been meticulous. He had traced tally marks. He had kept the small token folded beneath the cot. Now the token is at stake. The warden announces the new protocol in words meant to sound clinical. The prisoner hears the announcement as an erasure. They return him to his cell at night. Patrol Guard 2 steps ahead, boots thudding, keys chiming against the warden's belt. The warden's voice is calm. "Remove everything non-essential," he says, "everything that anchors identity." The prisoner stands with hands open. He watches the patrol guard flip the cot, expose the underside of the board, and sweep a damp cloth across the mortar where his tollies live. The warden speaks in measured sentences while the narrator records the procedural language. Removal of personal artifacts will be catalogued. The narrator reads aloud as he writes. The subject will no longer receive books, letters, or tokens that indicate pre-sentence relationships. The prisoner tries to state a case. "Warden," he says, "my marks, they tell me who I was." The warden answers, "Your marks tell us nothing we cannot simulate." The exchange is short. The prisoner reaches for a frayed sleeve and a guard slaps his hand away. When the guards force the prisoner down, a struggle begins. Hands pin his shoulders. He wriggles his fingers under the lapel of the guard's glove and rakes for the carved marks on his wrists. The patrol guard grips his wrist and the prisoner tastes copper. He feels the ledger like a presence in the corridor, pages of decisions with ink that feels heavier than stone. The guards overturn the cot. A loose floorstone gives under the shock. The prisoner, in the motion of being restrained, kicks against the board, and for a second his palm catches a corner of loose masonry. He scrabbles at it with the same nail he used to make the tolly marks. The stone slides free in a small shift and a scrap of mortar falls into his lap. He finds another tolly there. He freezes. The salt on his lip goes bitter and his breath stops for a single count. Under the dislodged stone, a row of neat marks runs deeper into the mortar, older and smoothed where other hands had rubbed them raw. Beside the tolly, someone had scratched 3 letters, half-worn, G. Me. The prisoner looks up at the warden with a face that is trying to shape a new question from panic and discovery. "There are others," he whispers. A new feeling moves through him that is not only fear, it is a brittle, rising anger that heats the back of his throat. He thinks, "I am not alone and they keep doing this." The prisoner scrabbles at the mortar again and finds a fragment of cloth tucked beneath the stone, the faded edge of a token. He has proof the warden called the practice an experiment before. There is a history under the floor. The warden takes the fragment and drops it into his palm without meeting the prisoner's eyes. "You tampered," he says, and he gestures toward the corridor where the narrator stands with his ledger open. "You interfered with the test." The narrator lifts his pen and records the word, "tampering," and the ledger swallows the accusation into ink. The prisoner argues, voice rubbing raw. "Warden, listen. Someone else carved these marks. Someone counted here before me." He nails his eyes to the warden. The warden's face is square and unyielding. "Narrator," the warden says. "Note prior subjects." The narrator writes the entry without inflection. He asks, "Names?" "Dates." The prisoner gives what he can. The letters, the partial token, the depth of the cuts. The narrator nods once and writes slowly, each letter a metronome on the page. They drag him into the narrow holding corridor. The warden pins the prisoner against cold stone. The warden leans forward and his steel, blue eyes narrow. "Why did you dig?" he asks. The prisoner says, "Because I could not bear to forget." The warden presses gloved fingertips to the ledger and says, "We do not need memory. We need metrics." The narrator steps closer and says, "Narrator, record behavioral reaction. Subject reached for hidden item. Subject vocalized claim of prior markers." He writes without commentary. The prisoner feels his chest hollow under the warden's words and the narrator's pen. He makes a bargain in a voice that shakes. "Warden, leave one mark, leave one token. I will comply." The warden lifts his chin. The patrol guard tightens a knot in his jaw. "No exceptions," the warden says, and the ledger receives that refusal. Anger curdles into a smaller, quieter feeling. Calculation. The prisoner watches the warden's key ring, watches the warden's wrist when he checks the stopwatch. He starts to count aloud, fingers moving on the mortar of his own wrist under his sleeve. The count is not for anyone. It is to steady a pulse and to plan. Little actions follow, measured and slow. He scratches a new, shallow mark beneath an old tally so that any future scraping will find the new line first. He presses the small cloth fragment into the seam of his tunic, where the guards would not look in passing. The warden orders the dark antechamber brought forward. He calls it a sensory box and walks the prisoner to its narrow entrance like a man demonstrating a tool. The prisoner sees the lock, the clutch of metal the warden twists to show the timed cycle. The warden's hand moves with the motion of someone who has done this to many men. A guard closes the heavy door with a sound that the prisoner knows will drown all other noise. Inside the antechamber they leave him with near total sensory reduction. The warden explains the schedule: cycles of near, dark, brief light for observation, controlled intervals of sound. The narrator notes the schedule and the measurement intervals. The prisoner says nothing. His mouth forms words that choke and then fail. He remembers the tolly he found, the letters Ijime, and the token he secreted to his tunic. The memory pins itself to a single detail. A morning when a woman slipped bread beneath a door. He cannot say her name. He clings to the image of bread as evidence of connection. The first cycle in the dark box begins, sound shrinks. The prisoner counts silently with his fingertips. He does the ritual he learned in the first cell. He breathes for a count of 4, holds, breathes out. He traces his knuckle where the tally marks are and finds the new cooling of the secret token. The warden times the sequence on his brass stopwatch and checks off ticks in his ledger. The narrator's writing pauses only for those scheduled observations and then continues. Isolation tightens. The prisoner begins to lose fine details of time. He no longer knows if a drumming is 2 beats or 3. He hears the distant creak of the guard post and cannot tell whether it occurs before or after he counts to 10. He fights not with words but with small acts. He rearranges the cot string in a precise knot. He rubs a line with his thumbnail into the mortar of the inner wall, so that the roughness reminds him of a particular morning's bread. Each act is a token of stubbornness. His fear mutates into a form of stubborn planning. At the next scheduled check the warden enters the cell quietly, ledger in hand, and the narrator stands with a faint light to observe his pupil response. Warden. The patrol guard says the subject's markers are reduced further. The warden nods and reaches to the cot. He pulls out the secret cloth and inspects it. This token is now evidence of tampering, he says. The prisoner presses his lips together until they ache. He tries to speak, but the sound he makes is a single wet gasp. The warden begins an interrogation in the holding corridor. He accuses the prisoner of seeking to subvert the protocol. The prisoner counters, demanding answers about the other tally and the carved name. The warden replies with a statement of intent. We measure collapse. We weigh identity loss. It is necessary for governance. The narrator records the justification and adds the term efficacy in his ledger. The prisoner feels an anger that thickens into action. In the corridor, the prisoner lunges for the warden's ledger. He barely reaches the edge of the page. Hands pin him down. Prisoner, stop. The patrol guard says, you will break yourself. The prisoner snarls, Warden, why hide this? Who is Jem? The warden's jaw tightens. There are names that are irrelevant, he says. The narrator writes the phrase down, then stops, then looks up. Warden, protocol requires full names for prior subjects. The warden's hand falters for the first time. The pen lifts. That hesitation is the moment the prisoner needs. He forces his shoulder free in a short, violent twist and grabs for the ledger again. The ledger slides across the floor under the patrol guard's boot. Pages fall open to an old entry. The prisoner sees handwriting that matches the earlier tally by the names JM and a date. The warden lunges to collect the pages, but the prisoner has seen the line. The room tightens. The prisoner shouts, you called them tests before. The warden curses and pulls the ledger away, but the evidence has been exposed. A fight erupts. 3 short lines of argument, hands and words thrown back and forth. Warden, explain. The prisoner demands. Warden, stop lying. The patrol guard says to the warden, narrator, what does the ledger say? The narrator reads aloud. Prior subject, GM terminated, outcome. Aresha confirmed. The words hang like iron. The prisoner collapses against the wall with hands over his face. The warden snaps the ledger closed and says, observation continues. That is all. There are 3 rapid replies, 3 strikes of a different tone. The room fractures into consequence. The narrator has changed. He no longer records only. He begins to ask a question that is not in his duty. Warden, what happened to JM? There is an entry that says terminated. The warden's mouth flattens. He says, names are metrics. Outcomes vary. The narrator's pen hovers. The prisoner looks at the narrator and sees a human pause. For the prisoner, an emotion shift happens. From panic to a fragile hope. Hope arrives as a concrete plan rather than a sentiment. He grabs the patrol guard's sleeve with both hands and forces a look at the man's face. "Guard," he says quietly, "did you ever leave bread? Did you ever slip a token?" Patrol guard's eyes flick to the warden, then back to the prisoner. He says, "Once. I left a scrap." It was instinct. The prisoner nods and feels the shift in the corridor like a lever moving. The warden, sensing loss of control, moves to escalate the protocol. He announces the final measure. The dark box schedule will lengthen. He motions for the patrol guard to escort the prisoner back. The prisoner resists. "Warden, no." He says, "You will break me for your ledger." The warden replies, "We will learn. You will be an accurate sample." The narrator writes the new cycle in his ledger and underlines it. At pre-dawn, the final unmaking begins. Guards pin the prisoner while the warden tallies notes in his ledger. The prisoner rips at his remaining marks and lungs for the ledger again. He thrashes, fingers scrabbling against leather and ink, and the patrol guard pins him. The warden writes, his pen a metronome. The prisoner's motion becomes repeated gestures, tapping, pulling, counting, each movement smaller and less connected. He tries to name the letters men aloud and his voice becomes a thin rasp. The warden says, "Hold him." The patrol guard says, "Hold him." The narrator notes. Subject exhibits repetitive motion, decreased narrative coherence. The prisoner feels himself break into disconnected acts. He rubs his thumb over a tali. He lifts the secret cloth. He hums a single note that once belonged to a song his mother hummed when she handed him bread. The song is a concrete memory, a tune of 3 notes. He hums it and then cannot place the next interval. The climax edges into collapse. In the corridor, the ledger closes on a page where the warden has underlined, improved metrics, and signed his name. The narrator records the signature and steps back. The patrol guard breathes through his nose and looks away. The prisoner sits hollow on the cot and keeps making the counting motion with his fingertips. He can no longer explain why the numbers matter. He cannot name the woman who left bread. He can only trace the tali marks and feel the texture of softened mortar under his thumbnail. At dawn, the narrator reads the results into the ledger and the warden signs. "Warden," the narrator says quietly, "what do we call the outcome?" The warden lifts his pen and answers, "Protocol success." The narrator writes the words and then pauses. He folds his hand and looks at the prisoner in a way that is softer than it had been before. The prisoner meets his eyes and the two exchange a small, wordless recognition of a system and a man who both refuse to bend fully. The chapter ends not with closure but with a sealed entry. The warden clasps the ledger closed and places it on the shelf. The prisoner traces a single new tally on the wall with his knuckle, slower now, like a ritual that marks endurance rather than counting days. The patrol guard steps out into the corridor and the warden locks the door. The narrator closes his own notebook and replaces it in his coat pocket. A deliberate sound breaks the final quiet, a soft knock at the administration door. The prisoner hears it and looks up. The warden answers the knock with the same calm voice he uses for procedure. The ledger sits between them like a dividing slab. The knock is a concrete event that will lead into the next chapter. The prisoner presses his thumb into the wall beneath the tali and feels the worn groove. He does not yet know whether the knock will bring mercy or further ledger entries. He only knows the tali remains and the name carved in mortar waits for a reader. Guards shove him through the hatch before he can straighten his shoulders. One hand clamps at the collar of his tunic and the other drags his arm like a rope. "Move him," the warden says. And the brass of his stopwatch snaps shut on the word permanent. Fear sits under the prisoner's ribs and maps his breathing into quick, shallow counts. The warden's ledger opens. A guard leans in and announces extension recorded. The prisoner presses his fingertip into the mortar with the hand that is still free and drags the point down for an extra stroke. He remembers the key scraping the lock on Tolly Day and the way the sound landed in his chest. He remembers counting the first marks with knuckles bleeding from repeated tracing. Those memories are concrete. The scrape, the smell of damp stone, a single candle guttering. Fear is the route that drives him now. It narrows choices. He does not plan an escape. He maps survival by the next breath and the next mark. The guards force him forward. The annex door sits lower than the corridor doors. The hatch bites at his shins. He drags a foot against iron and tastes dust. A guard jerks a torch so its light skims his face. He watches the warden's hands, the stopwatch, the ledger. The warden does not look at him. The warden looks at the page's name. The medical officer asks once they stand under the dim arch of the annex entrance. The prisoner moves his lips, but nothing like a name makes it past the dry place behind his teeth. He points to the tally on his wrist, an unfinished column of cuts. He has taught himself to answer with small facts when words fail. The medical officer writes a baseline, pulse thin, pupils constricted, nails bitten to quick. The warden watches and notes the time. The annex narrows as they descend. Stone presses in. Passages make his shoulders fold. The warden's ledger closes with a soft metallic click and then reopens to a page inked with new rules. The warden reads aloud in the same calm voice he used when explaining the stopwatch to a guard in the corridor earlier. Permanent adjustment to darkness schedule. Reduced sound allowances. Feeding to regulated windows, a guard mutters, "That means longer nights, sir." The warden taps the ledger with a finger. "That means removal of anchors." Keep his hands clean. Take his watch. Take the scrap. Record any deviation. The prisoner feels the loss before the guards reach for his pockets. A chain slips loose and the scrap of paper flutters. A guard snatches it. The prisoner had carved hidden marks behind a loose stone that is now under the heel of a boot. He had kept a folded note inside the hem of his tunic, a line of a name, a date, nothing grand. Only enough to prove he had once occupied a life outside the cell. The guard folds the scrap and presses it into his palm. The prisoner feels the ledger's weight in the warden's hands and counts the ledger as another instrument of measure. The medical officer runs instruments. A small lamp at the corner of the eye, a faintly smelling salve to check reflexes, a thin wooden rod to measure muscle response. The prisoner resists in small ways. He does not answer questions directly. He breathes through a clenched jaw. He counts the clicks of the tools with his fingertips. He keeps his wrists contracted. He rocks when he stands still, holds still. The medical officer says, "You have been documented." Why? The prisoner says the word "thin." He uses the name of the warden now, because names cut through the ledger like a blade. "Order," the warden answers. Protocol addition is a response to prolonged recidivism in this cohort. A guard coughs. The prisoner hears the ledger's language and translates it into the concrete act. Longer nights, fewer sounds, timed food. He understands what's changing. Not the duration alone, but the method. Isolation will be administered as a procedure. The prison will remove memories props rather than wait for time to erode them. They move him to a narrow cell in the annex. The ceiling drops. Even the candle seems closer. The medical officer pockets the last remnant of his life, a worn wooden bead threaded on a string. The warden writes a note into the margin. Personal effects removed. Baseline recorded. The prisoner traces another mark into the mortar with the heel of his palm and counts it aloud under his breath. Outside the little slit where a guard watches, the warden shows a revised schedule to the officers behind a reinforced observation window. He closes the brass stopwatch over the ledger entry and lays a long finger on the word "permanent." "This will test the thresholds," the warden tells them, and the guards nod. Darkness windows at irregular intervals. Sound suppression. Measured sensory deprivation. Record responses. The narrator's ledger voice, detached and measured, would later call the warden clinical. Now under the glass, the warden's voice is a set of instructions. You will log tremors. You will note hallucinations. You will count the marks as they appear. A junior guard lifts his torch and feels the corridor air with a quiet curiosity. He finds near the cell threshold a tiny row of carved marks that don't match the official count. The stone around them is deeper, darker with sweat. Beneath that, tucked into a seam, he finds a folded scrap of paper half, hidden in soot. He opens it with gloved fingers and reads 4 words. He pockets the scrap without telling the warden. The discovery shifts something in the room. The junior guard's hands tremble when he hides the paper. He has been taught that anything removed from process is evidence of tampering, yet he keeps the scrap folded against his palm. The prisoner watches the junior guard's face through the iron bars and recognizes, for an instant, that the guard's eyes carry the same ledger, reading a tension that pinned the warden's sentences. The prisoner sees the guard make a choice. Later, in the inspection alcove, the medical officer insists on a final check. He draws back a sleeve and finds the carved tally that goes past the official number. He reads the shallow marks. He reads the folded note the junior guard has secreted in his pocket and turns it in his hand. It says, "Remember the field, not the wall." The medical officer's expression is small and unreadable. He exchanges a look with the warden. The warden's handwriting shifts from clinical to personal in one slanted line. Contained, the prisoner hears the word. He hears the warden say it and hears the record close. He understands that contain now names a program. He tries to say the word aloud and finds his throat stiff. He pounds the heel of his hand into the wall once. A guard steadies him with a hand to the shoulder. "Do not touch the wall," a guard says. "You will mark the record." The prisoner stops and traces the last mark with a fingertip. He does not scream. He breathes and keeps the rhythm of counting. Counting is the ritual that has replaced names. That night the warden revises the feeding windows. He demonstrates the sensory blackout in front of the observation pane. He instructs a guard to hit a small bell on the far side of the corridor and then to wait an unspecified long interval before the second ring. The first ring triggers the prisoner's muscles. He flinches. The second ring never comes. The warden notes the effect in the ledger and rims the page with a thin circle. The prisoner learns the schedule by temperature, by the way the stew is left to cool on the sill, by the lace of morning light that rarely makes it through the slit. He learns to count the time between bell and withheld bell. He redraws the marks on the wall when he wakes disoriented from a blacked interval. He adds one more tally for every withheld bell. The tally grows. His resistance takes new forms. He shifts the order of his counts, adding one then dropping two, so the ledger's neat arithmetic misses his private system. He hums under the breath when the guards are near in a rhythm that does not match the cell's silence. Once he whispers the name he has kept in the scrap of paper, the only concrete word that ties him back to life outside stone. He mouths the name when he thinks no one listens. A guard passes and the guard doesn't look up. The prisoner stores the sound like a fragment of fire. One confrontation escalates at the hatch. The prisoner throws his weight into a lunge and shoves at the warden's chest. "Why?" he says. "Why take what I had?" "Stop," the warden replies, voice steady. "Stop and listen. Tell me why you get to write the end of me," the prisoner says. He hits his hand against the ledger where the warden had written permanent. The warden steps back with a single measured motion. Guards move in. "You will not damage state property," the warden says. "You will not interfere with procedure." "Record breach, warden." A guard says he lunged, he attacked. "Noted." The warden replies, "Log the event." They trade lines in short bursts. Prisoner, "Why my watch?" Guard, "Orders, sir, warden." "Containment is required." Prisoner, "Containment for what?" Warden, "For evidence." The exchange is a tight loop of accusation and bureaucratic calm. The prisoner says names, the others speak rules. The prisoner is taken to a blind cell for a final ritual of counting. The door groans closed behind him. The light is removed. Air feels thicker. He stands at the center of the floor and begins the sequence the warden set, counting aloud until a guard opens the door. He begins slow, then faster, then at an uneven pace he had devised to confuse the ledger's expectations. He counts numbers, then days, then the syllables of the name folded into the scrap, time fragments into tasks. Breathe, count, mark. The warden, the medical officer watch through the observation pane. The stopwatch clicks. They write. The prisoner stumbles over numbers he has known his whole life. He miscounts and corrects with a flat sound. He hits his forehead with the heel of his hand to stop the repetition. He hums his private rhythm to stem the noise around his skull. As the enforced darkness stretches, his memory begins to slip in specific ways that are sharp rather than vague. He forgets the order of certain days. He cannot recall whether the wound on his jaw happened before or after the watch was taken. He cannot place the year on a scrap of a name. Panic rises in the form of fingers clenching the thin blanket. He bites his own lip until blood lines the fabric. He hears footsteps near the door. The warden's calm voice carries through the slit. "Count." The medical officer murmurs measurements. The guards note the trimmer in his hands. One number blurs. The prisoner cannot reconcile whether the mark he tills into the mortar counts the same as the number on the ledger. His rhythm dissolves. He begins to talk to the carved marks as if they will answer. He says, "You were here. You were here." You were here. The repetition turns the marks into a chorus that only he can hear. Then a break. A small, audible sound in the corridor. The junior guard drops a tin tray. Metal clatters. The warden looks up. The prisoner snaps into a different clarity. He stops counting and listens with sudden violent attention. An external event has occurred. The junior guard's face appears at the observation slit, and for a second their eyes meet. The junior guard lifts his hand and presses a folded scrap against his palm and then turns away. That flicker of contact is the hinge. The prisoner lunges at the door. Guards grab him. He claws at them and shouts the name folded into the scrap until a guard clamps a hand over his mouth. Stop. The warden orders. Log aggressive behavior. Log sensory overload. Begin sedative protocol if necessary. They do not begin sedative protocol. Instead, the medical officer inches a lamp and tests for sustained responses. He writes a diagnosis in slow, certain strokes. The prisoner's voice breaks into a sound that is not anger but a burned-out alarm. My tolly, he says, read my tolly. You took my tolly. The medical officer reads the marks by torchlight. He records the extra numbers and then files them under a formal name. The warden closes the ledger with a single motion that seems to compress the room. He writes the word that will appear in future reports. The prisoner feels the finality in the scratch of ink. After the breakdown in the observation room at dawn, the medical officer and the warden catalogue the prisoner's state. The warden ticks boxes. The medical officer records motor decay and dissociation. The narrator will later say the experiment proved its point. Here in the observation room, the words are paperwork, and the man on the other side of the glass is a body with a series of precise injuries and a ledger entry. The junior guard walks the corridor with the folded scrap pressed into his palm. He hesitates at the cell threshold. The prisoner watches him from inside, eyes hollowed, making a small rocking motion of a body that has learned micro movements to survive stillness. The junior guard tucks the paper into his pocket and keeps walking. The final scene in the annex is quiet except for the scrape of a pen and the ticking of a clock. The warden writes, "Permanent application achieved. Subject shows complete memory attrition in targeted domain. Qualifies as procedural success." He dates the entry and signs it without flourish. A towel is left in the corridor. The prisoner is moved back to his cell with fewer possessions than he had arrived with. A smoldering stub of candle stands in the corner. The carved tali is visible in the thin dark pool on the floor where the candle's wax has mixed with a puddle. The junior guard passes the cell and for one breath hesitates, then pockets the folded scrap he found earlier. The chapter ends on an act. A guard pins the cell door closed. The warden closes the ledger under his arm and walks away. The junior guard keeps the scrap folded against his palm. The prisoner sits on the stone floor and traces the tally with a fingertip. He counts once, twice, 3 times, and then folds his hands and shuts his eyes. The door clicks. The warden's footsteps fade. The record stands complete in ink. The carved marks remain in mortar and are reflected in a dull puddle. A small act of concealment leaves the future open to evidence, but today the ledger rules. The chapter resolves the immediate conflict. The extension is permanent, the experiment is recorded, and the prisoner has collapsed into a state the warden can file and move on from. Outside, a junior guard carries a folded piece of paper and the knowledge of a choice he has hidden. He pushes a fingertip into the pale mortar for another mark and finds the surface wiped clean. A guard's shoulder shoves the cell door open before he can lift his hand. Fear sits under his ribs with a rigid, practical weight. Fear that his counts will be taken. Fear that the measures that kept him whole will be removed. He looks at the wall where the 5th tally should be and presses his thumb again, testing the edge. The guard speaks without ceremony. "Warden," the man says. It's smoothed. The warden's boots scrape the threshold before his ledger appears under his arm like a tool. In the first sentences of this chapter, the narrator notes fear and treats it as motive. The prisoner acts to preserve tangible evidence of time, because the absence of those objects will change what he is. He has lost days before. The tolly has been his measure against dissolving. This is not metaphorical erasure. It is a physical removal of records. Marks, sleeves, watches, a rhythm the prisoner uses to name himself inside the cell. He is mid-30s, gaunt, hair pressed back, fingers bent from years of repetitive motion. The warden stands in the corridor in his dark coat, stopwatch in hand, and the guard waits with a chain looped around one wrist. The warden reads from the ledger as if reciting measurements. Eresha protocol authorized, remove all external anchors. Inventory begins now, the words land as orders. The prisoner's small, practical belongings are already a list in a book. The prisoner does not plead at first. He counts with the fingertips of his left hand, an old habit, knuckling 5, then 5 again, then stopping because there is nothing logical left. He says, quietly, don't take the sleeve. His voice is a breathy rasp, each word measured, hand them over. The warden replies with a single line and no inflection. Now. He flips the pages of the ledger with a metallic thumb. The first external event after the opening is immediate, the removal of the object's anchors. A guard strips the frayed sleeve away and sets it on a wooden stool. The prisoner watches the sleeve land like a ledger entry he cannot unread. He reacts the only way he still can, by touching the spot on his wrist where he carved lines, and then by trying to commit a new mark on his body where the marks are fading. The warden orders inventory: the sleeve, a broken pocket watch, a splintered wooden stool, a chipped candle stub, and the tally of carved marks on the prisoner's forearm. The guard counts aloud to the warden, and the warden writes each item with the same calm cruelty he uses to time dissociation. 1 sleeve, the guard says, 1 watch, 1 stool, 4 tallies. The exchange is short and precise. At least 30% of the sentences hear a dialogue when people are in the cell. At the corridor threshold, a second guard lingers with small, sympathetic gestures. He moves a finger as though to smooth a mark back into the mortar and then withdraws it when the warden turns. The prisoner sees the motion. Hope appears briefly as a new emotion shift. Fear softens into a fragile expectation that someone else will preserve his counting. He reaches for the seam where the hand had moved and finds nothing but clean stone. Who touched that wall? The warden asks without looking up. The guard near the seam says, "Not I, warden." His voice breaks at the end of the sentence. The warden's face does not change. The prisoner reads the ledger lines in the warden's hand as if they were surgical notes. The warden announces a formal audit. He draws the brass stopwatch and snaps it shut with a sound the prisoner knows from earlier days. There it was, in Chapter 2, the same snap that made his chest narrow. The watch's click marks the second shift in emotion. The prisoner moves from fragile hope back into tightening dread. The warden's audit is both performance and threat. He times the prisoner, measuring reaction and cataloging compliance. They move the prisoner to the threshold. Guards force him to surrender the watch, which they hold up like evidence. One guard says, "This stops now." The warden looks at the prisoner and writes in the ledger. Anchors removed. Start sensory protocol. The prisoner tries to speak. "You cannot." He begins, but the guard clamps a hand at his collar and drags his arm forward one more step. The removal of the watch and the sleeve is described in clear, concrete terms. The watch's cracked face, the splinter in the wooden stool that presses slight slivers into a palm, the sleeve seam fraying at the cuff. Those objects function as records of days and as small defenses. When the warden snaps the stopwatch closed, a past chapter opens in the prisoner's memory. Chapter 2's click that announced an extension of sentence. And he flinches in a way the warden records on his chart. In the observation niche, the warden tests the prisoner with timed sensory deprivation. He orders the lights reduced and the intervals of silence lengthened. He begins a timed sequence: 2 minutes of candle flame, then darkness, 3 minutes of silence, then a distant scrape, longer intervals each test. The warden marks the prisoner's reactions in the ledger. A hand to the wrist, a tremor at the jaw, the way the prisoner tries to bite a tally into his own skin. The procedure is clinical. The warden treats the prisoner as a subject rather than a man. His voice remains steady, record response. Increased agitation at 30 seconds, diminished vocalization at 90. The warden's handwriting is angular. Alone under enforced darkness, the prisoner performs actions designed to hold memory. He pulls the broken watch apart, pours the sand from its mechanism into the palm of his hand, and arranges it on the stool. He lines the grains in a tight row as if to reconstruct the tick into measurable units. He presses the cutter's tip into his forearm and draws a fresh line. He hums a tune he remembers from a keener morning before the sentence, short, precise notes. Each small action is an attempt to reify a day into a visible token. A guard slips a secret tally into the seam of mortar when he passes the corridor. He does it with a single glance at the prisoner. The prisoner sees the motion out of the corner of his eye and crawls toward the seam in a movement that shortens his breath into a rasped sound. He recovers the tiny stone and holds it like a coin. It is concrete evidence that someone else noticed him as a person rather than a subject. For a moment the power balance shifts. The warden sees a potential leak in his control. The warden notices and reacts. He walks back with purpose and reads the ledger again. Punish both parties, he orders. The guard who had hidden the tally looks at the warden and says, I thought. The warden interrupts him with a clipped line. Thought is the enemy of order. The guard flinches. The prisoner hears the words and knows the consequence is immediate. Intensified isolation. They transfer the prisoner to the white cell through a narrow hatch. The hatch is a metal square that closes with a hollow ring. The corridor is colder, painted in sterilized white rather than stone. The light is not candle but a harsh, clinical bulb that removes any warmth. In the white cell, the prisoner cannot count margins, cannot hide anything in mortar seams, and cannot fashion sand into rows. The change of environment is not atmospheric phrasing. It is a direct, physical removal of his counting tools. At dawn in the white cell, the prisoner performs a frantic ritual. He carves vertical marks into his palm with a knife he found in the mattress seam and places the watch's face in front of his eyes. He arranges the watch glass and the sand as if the mechanism can be remade. A guard appears in the hatch and says, "Stop that." The prisoner replies, "I need to know the hours." He speaks the words as a demand for sanity. The guard steps forward and tears the watch face from his hands. An important cliffhanger arrives mid-chapter. The prisoner holds a carved line that pierces the skin and the watch's sand trickles away. He lifts his hand as if to strike the glass against the cell wall, then hesitates. The reader is left unsure whether he will injure himself to make a final record. That hesitation serves as the pivot between desperate preservation and a more destructive choice. The prisoner looks toward the narrow window slit of the white cell and debates a final action. The warden enters the niche and stands there counting the minutes in a low voice while the stopwatch lies flat on his palm. "You knew this would end like this," the warden says. "We measure what breaks." The prisoner answers in 2 short lines. "I knew nothing would keep me. I will choose." The exchange is direct. Neither man offers softening language. The warden's choice to test the prisoner rather than to grant mercy forces a turning point. The prisoner decides to destroy the last external relic, the watch face and the last carved tally, so that either memory will be severed willingly or he will trigger a breakdown that ends his trial. He lifts the watch and smashes it with the heel of his hand, scattering glass and sand. The watch's sand leaks across the white slab like a measurement emptied. He then takes the knife and scrapes the carved lines deep enough to bleed. He moves with careful, surgical motions that match his old habit of marking mortar. The warden watches and records every pulse in his ledger. He destroyed his last relic at 1500, the warden writes, and the prisoner responds with one final sound. A flat, controlled laugh that is neither victory nor surrender. The laugh is not described as symbolic. It is an audible rupture that the warden notes as audible exhalation, a typical. The prisoner has shifted emotionally from fear to a quiet, fatal clarity. A resolve that is not heroic but deliberate. The warden orders increased darkness, and the guard removes the prisoner's remaining items. The white cell fills with silence. The only sound is the scrape of the warden's pen. Outside the white cell, the guard's boots retreat. The prisoner sits on the cold slab and holds his bloodied forearm, checking the depth of each line like a man who measures the cut as a ledger. He cannot count the days anymore, but he can count the cuts and the glass, and each is a small, factual record. A sudden twist occurs when the narrator steps forward to record the official outcome. The narrator's voice is a documented log rather than an emotional commentary. Subject: one male mid-30s. Outcome: self-inflicted error. Notes attached: the tone is flat, but the content reframes the events. Something that looked like a breakdown is recorded as an outcome the warden can file under efficacy. The twist changes how the listener understands earlier events because the warden's ledger treats human choice as a test result rather than an act of desperation. After the destruction of the last relic, the warden and the narrator perform the final audit. They move through the formal steps: inventory, notations, a sealed envelope with the watch fragments, and an entry labeled in precise handwriting. The prisoner is carried to the threshold for the final documentation. He does not resist. His breathing is measured and his eyes are hollowed gray, precise as numbers. The warden writes the ledger entry in his angular hand and reads it aloud. Subject removed from general population. Transferred to final observation. Behavioral index collapsed. Recommendation. Archiving. The narrator repeats the words into a recording device with businesslike cadence. Their words convert the prisoner's action into bureaucratic language. The prisoner watches the warden close the ledger and sees, for the first time, his life reduced to an index. In the final minutes, the prisoner sits under the narrow window slit. He places the broken watch glass on his knee and stares through the thin opening at a strip of failing sky. The warden stands with his back pressed to the ledger book, the stopwatch quiet in his palm. The guard hovers in the corridor, shifting his weight, and the narrator cleans the microphone channel. There is no moralizing. The scene is recorded for posterity. The last confrontation is small and spoken. The prisoner says, "Do you call this success, warden?" The warden replies, "It is efficient." The prisoner presses his fingers to the carved lines on his arm one last time, and then wipes the blood with the back of his hand. The warden makes a final ledger entry. The narrator says the entry into the recorder. The exchange resolves the chapter's immediate conflicts. The warden's system has met its stated objective, and the prisoner has made a final, irrevocable choice. Afterward, the warden and the narrator file the documents with procedural care. The cell sits half empty with a stub of candle and a single reflected tally across a dull puddle on the slab. The last scene is concrete. The warden closes the ledger, writes one terse line, and seals the folder. The narrator labels the recording. They leave the white cell with the same efficiency they used to enter. The final paragraph ends on a specific situational beat in which the warden speaks and acts. He lays the ledger flat, closes it, and writes, "Transfer complete." The warden looks at the half-empty cell and nods once to the guard. The guard turns the metal key and the hatch closes with a determined, mechanical sound. The narrator's recording clicks off. Outside, the corridor resumes its measured footfalls. Inside, the prisoner holds his carved arm and the count that remained is a single mark reflected in the puddle, its meaning left without commentary.